Welcome back. This lecture is on conformity and obedience, which are two important topics in social psychology. So for today's lecture, we're going to talk about both conformity and obedience, of course. For conformity, we will define conformity, go over some reasons why people conform, and then I'm going to review a very classic set of research studies done by Solomon Asch that kind of some early social psychology studies that demonstrated that under many circumstances, people will conform in a group situation. And then we'll also talk about obedience, or I'll define obedience, and then I'll also review one of the more famous experiments or set of experiments, not just in social psychology, but in psychology in general, which is Stanley Milgram's shock experiments. So after hearing this lecture, I hope that you'll understand the two primary reasons why people often conform to perceived norms, that you will know how conformity and obedience to authority have been examined in laboratory studies and some of the implications of these findings from these investigations. And again, I'm going to focus on two classic studies by Solomon Asch and then by Stanley Milgram, and then know some of the issues and sources of controversy surrounding Milgram's study. Sorry, I should say study there. The name itself might convey by the name shock studies that these were very controversial and indeed they were even unethical. So I'll go over some of the reasons for that when I review that. All right, let's just go over some definitions. So by conformity, we're talking about a change in one's attitude or behavior due to another person or perceived social norm. So we can conform to things and we don't have to be face to face with another person. We don't have to kind of be the recipient of what we often think of as peer pressure, where somebody is actively trying to make us change our attitude or behavior. We can change our behavior just due to some perception that there's an appropriate way to think or act. And that's what we mean when we're talking about a norm. A norm is a culturally accepted belief or behavior. So there's, I think, in your everyday lives, some very obvious examples of conformity. So if you look at like different trends in popular culture, look at the way people dress or what they listen to, we see that people will change their habits or change their behaviors or change their patterns based on what's currently popular. So we can say that that's conformity. We've also got our views on different political issues, on religious questions, on lifestyle. And to some extent, if you think about your attitudes and your beliefs, those are based to some degree on the people that you interact with, or even just what you think maybe like the prevailing consensus is. So in many ways, our attitudes about even things that are important, like our political attitudes and our religious attitudes, are shaped by other people. And in some ways, when we change our beliefs, we are conforming to others. All right. So why is it that people conform? Well, to start, humans possess an inherent tendency to imitate or to mimic the actions of others. And so this is known as the chameleon effect, which is our tendency to non-consciously, that is without our awareness, mimic the postures, mannerisms, facial expressions, and the behaviors of our interaction partners. And what research finds is that we do this behavioral mimicry because it increases the connection that we feel with the other person, the person that we're interacting with, and it actually allows our interactions and our conversations to flow more smoothly. So the idea here is that we are ultimately these social animals, these social primates. We have a necessity for connection with people, and we have these built-in tendencies to kind of conform, as in we change our behaviors even non-consciously to match the people that we interact with. However, we also conform um, because of more conscious reasons that we're more aware of. And one of these reasons is to gain acceptance from other people. And so the definition of normative influence is going along with the crowd, that is conforming, changing our attitudes, or changing our behaviors because we're concerned about what others think of us. Okay? So people reflexively don't want to look out of place or become the target of criticism for other people. So fitting in and being an accepted member of a group is important. And this is because fitting in with others brings lots of good things. It brings rewards, social support, friendship, camaraderie. So the basic idea is that one of the reasons that we conform is due to this normative influence, wanting to be accepted and to be a part of social groups, because we are, after all, social animals and we have a need to belong. However, we don't merely conform out of wanting to be accepted or because we fear being rejected by others. We also conform in order to be accurate, to be appropriate, and to do the right thing. And this is based on the idea that people have a fundamental need for accuracy. So we conform to the influence of others because we see them as a source of information to guide our behavior. And this is known as informational influence. The idea that other people are sources of information and they provide information as to what the proper or appropriate course of action is. And indeed, most of the time we're motivated to do the right thing. So if society deems that we pick up our trash and we put our litter in the garbage can and we recycle, or we speak softly when we're in the library, or that it's appropriate to tip your waiter, at least in the US, but if you travel abroad, it's not so customary. We're motivated to figure out what is the right thing to do and what is socially appropriate. And so what is socially appropriate is known as a descriptive norm. This is our perception of what most people do in a given situation. So and it's important to think about a descriptive norm because what society expects of us is not necessarily explicit. It's not so clear. We have to rely on our perception of what most people are doing. It's not like we're getting a set of written instructions, right? We have to kind of perceive what the right thing to do is. So if you've ever been a part of a conversation that went, do you think that we should do this? What is everybody else doing? Then you're kind of trying to figure out what the descriptive norm is. So descriptive norms are very powerful. So for instance, there's been research that has shown that homeowners will reduce their energy usage after learning that they were consuming more than their neighbors. I know that I get a report in the mail that tracks our gas and electric usage based on our neighbors. And when we figure out that we're using more, we often try to cut back. Other research has found that college students were more likely to select a healthy food option when they were led to believe that other students had also made that choice. Based on the picture here, hotel guests are more likely to reuse their towels when there's a sign in the bathroom that told them that most other guests choose to reuse their towel. So the short of it is that we often try to figure out, using descriptive norms, what do most people do? Like, what is socially appropriate? And that is a basis of informational influence and a basis to often conform or to change our behavior. And so I hope what you're kind of getting from this part of the lecture is that conformity often has a negative connotation, especially in the US or in Western societies, is that it's usually viewed as a bad thing. And it's probably because we have the peer pressure kind of situations from our youth or high school in our brains, is that conforming and succumbing to peer pressure is a bad thing. But social psychologists merely talk about conformity as a change in attitudes and behaviors, and changing one's attitudes or behaviors isn't necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, when you change behaviors in, say, positive directions and act in more conscientious and considerate ways towards others, towards the environment, towards yourself in terms of your own health and well-being, we could say that that's even a good thing. So conformity doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. All right. What makes it more likely for people to conform for these informational reasons? Ambiguity is the most crucial factor. Okay, so when a situation is ambiguous, we use each other as a source of information. And so the more that we're kind of unsure of what the appropriate thing to do is, we will look to others as a way to gain a source of information. And so you can think about probably multiple opportunities in your life where you're kind of unsure as to say, is this allowed? What's correct? What's incorrect? And so especially when it's a new situation, it's ambiguous, it's unclear, this is when we look more to the actions of others as a way to guide and then change our own behavior. Stressful situations would be in another. So in stressful or even crisis situations, we usually don't have the time to stop and think about exactly what course of action we should take. So in an emergency, the last time that if anybody has ever been in like a fire drill or something like that, we tend to follow the actions of others. And so if there's a light going off or a buzzer and we see people walking to the exits, it's like, oh, okay, I better just follow along here. And that would especially be the case when there's actually a crisis. We're also more likely to conform for informational reasons when other people are experts. And this is because usually greater expertise is associated with them having more information than we do. So if you think about changing behaviors based on, I got some animations here, based on the advice of a doctor, okay, and whether that's avoiding junk food, whether that's exercising more frequently, whether that's taking one's vitamins, we're conforming, and we're doing that for informational reasons, and we're doing so because we're looking at the advice of somebody who we deem to be an expert. So changing behaviors or conforming because of expert information would be another example. And then a fourth reason would be we legitimately want to know the right way to think or feel. I think about this particularly for folks that identify with certain political parties that might watch a lot of, let's just say, news on certain channels. And the way that they want to think about the world is often driven by their political party or even certain members in that political party. And so folks legitimately want to know the right way to think or feel, and so they're very open to the influence of other people as a guide for saying what is the right way to think about different social issues or political issues of the day. I legitimately want to know how I should think about this. What are other people saying? All right, so on this diagram, I've got the results of both informational and normative influence. And so on the top, we can see that the primary influence or the primary motivation underlying the process of informational influence is the motivation to be accurate. We want to think and feel and behave in ways that are socially appropriate, and that results in something called internalization. That is, we change our mind, but then we come to truly internalize and actually believe whatever it is we're believing. At times, though, we have the other motivation, which is just to be accepted by others. And so, if we change our behavior because of this normative influence that is conforming to be accepted, that often results in what is known as public compliance. I'm complying with the crowd or the group in public so as to be accepted or not to be criticized, but inside, I don't really believe it. I don't really accept what I'm doing. And so that's kind of your typical peer pressure scenario. I'm going along. I know it's not the right thing to do. I don't really believe in it, but I just want to be accepted so much, or I don't want to be rejected. You'll see this dashed line, however. It's important to point out that the need to be accepted can also result in informational influence and then a process of internalization. So some people want to be accepted into different social groups so much, and whether that's a peer group, whether that's a political party, whether that's a religious ideology, the need to be accepted so much can then result in an internalization of those beliefs. So people that convert to a religion, or if they're not religious, they find religion. And this is just one example, by the way. I hope nobody's taking offense. But some people will find their way to a particular religion, or let's even go one step further, into a cult. And they have such a strong need to be accepted by others that they end up changing their thoughts and their feelings and their behaviors about things. And that really does result in an internalization of the tenets of that faith, or in some cases of the very wacky views of that cult. So changing the way that people dress, changing what they eat, changing social habits, etc. It can start out as a motivation to be accepted, but that can also result in an internalization in those types of cases. So the motivation to be accepted can have both results depending on the two different pathways there. Okay, so I want to go over a classic research study that demonstrates that many people, and it's been determined that even most people, will conform in a kind of a group pressure situation. So Solomon Asch conducted a series of studies, which we'll just kind of collectively refer to as the line judging studies. He provided several accounts of his studies, in other words, papers that he wrote, but the general experimental procedure was the same, where he had male college students come into a laboratory setting. They were told that they were going to be participating in a study of visual perception. Anywhere from 7 to 9 of these college men were then seated in a semicircle pattern, and in front there was a board, like a classroom chalkboard, that displayed different visual stimuli to be judged. And so there were 18 of these cards. Okay, these had these visual stimuli, which were lines. There was 18 different trials, and on each trial they saw the two cards. One was a standard card, which is here on the left, that had a single line that was to be judged in comparison to the 3 lines on the other card. And the task was a very simple one. It was just to indicate which line on the test card matched the standard. Okay. So he did something called a pilot study. And so in a pilot study, you do a small study using a kind of a smaller number of participants, in order to test out the stimuli that you're going to use in your experiment or your study. So he had 36 participants individually judge the lengths of line. And he actually did 20 different presentations of lines, just like the ones that you see in this slide. So when asked to compare and identify the standard line with the 3 lines that you see here, the only 3 mistakes were made across 720 trials. So basically, there's a less than 1% error rate among individuals. So when people do this on their own, it's a very easy task. It's not ambiguous. It would say it'd be even the correct answer here is C, but it'd be even easier than this. Okay, so very easy task for people, a less than 1% error rate. All right, but what about when people get together in a group? Okay, so here's a hyperlink, and so I encourage you to click on this. This is a YouTube video. It's very short. I think it's less than 3 minutes long, but it just goes over the basic procedure. Right. So what he did is he brought people into the lab, and again, it's usually between 7 to 9 men. All the actual participants were naive. They had no idea what was going on, but everyone else in the experiment was known as a confederate. So this is basically somebody that is in on the experiment and helps out the experimenter. So they're not real participants, they're playing along. So when showing the 2 different cards and in judging the lengths of the line, the men were asked to state their answers out loud, beginning at one end and then moving down the row. The person who is the naive participant was always second to last. And so in the picture, it's this person right here who's looking very concerned and looking at the cards. So on the first 2 trials, there were the Confederates gave correct answers. But then starting on the 3rd trial, and then on 11 subsequent trials, the Confederates gave the same wrong answer. So on these critical trials, the question was how many participants would change their answer. Now again, when he did the study just with individuals, everybody can get the lines right. Like it's not a tough perceptual task. It's relatively it's almost completely unambiguous. But knowing that, the question was, now that a naive participant has just heard 6 other people, 5 or 6 other people, depending on how many on what study it was, but most of the group just give the wrong answer, what would the naive participant do? So here's the results. So here's the 12 critical trials in which the Confederates gave the incorrect answer. Here's the accuracy rate among the pilot study, the people who judged the length by themselves. You can see that a nearly 100% accuracy rate. However, when in a group situation, the accuracy rate drops quite a bit. And so this is evidence that people are changing their answer because they heard other people give the wrong answer. Okay, so in the 1956 paper, which is the one that we'll focus on here, there was 123 participants. Overall, there was 37% conformity across the 12 critical trials. 76% of the participants gave at least one incorrect response, and there was 5% that conformed on every single trial. 24% never conformed at all. So here's a different way to look at those results. What we have here are 24% of people that did not conform as well at all, and then we've got 76% of people that conformed at least once. Okay, there was 5% in here that conformed on all 12. And so what Asch concluded is that there's some people that are just non-conformists. They're completely independent. It doesn't matter what anybody else in the group said. They were going to give the correct answer no matter what. There's also this segment here. Okay, again, there's 12 critical trials, so conforming on 7 or more would be conforming on the majority. So this is a total of 38%, so a little bit more than 1/3 had a high rate of conformity. And so these were people that his own language, that these are people that are yielding, but we might say that these are people that are more likely to conform. And then we've got the rest. This is everyone else. This is also about 38% of participants, so a little bit more than a third, conform to some degree, either once, twice, 3 times, or up to 6 times. All right. So the majority, 76%, conformed at least once, and 24% not at all. So the conclusion was people will conform, and according to Asch, people will conform because of these normative reasons. Wanting to be accepted, not wanting to be criticized, not wanting to stand out. And the reason that he made that conclusion was because of how unambiguous the task was. There's a close to 100% accuracy rate when by oneself. So it's very difficult, especially among these folks, to suggest that they would be conforming for informational reasons, because we know that this is an unambiguous task. So it must be the case that it just felt awkward to be in a group of people when they're giving what should have been the obviously wrong answer, but then to give the right answer and kind of stand out. Apparently 24% of people in this study had no problem doing that, but most people changed their response at least on one trial, presumably because of this awkwardness of not wanting to stand out and give a different answer. He went on to do this study many different times and kind of different variations. Interestingly, what he found is he was able to show that there's about as much conformity when there's 3 Confederates, 4, 6, 7, 9, and 15. Okay, so you don't get a lot more conformity once you go beyond 3 Confederates. Okay, if there's only one person that gives the wrong answer, not much conformity at all. 2 people that give the wrong answer, also not too much conformity. But there's something special about hitting this number of 3. But once you hit that number of 3, adding people doesn't seem to make a difference. And that effect has been found in quite a few studies afterwards, is that there's kind of this diminishing return. And the idea might be is once you've got 3 people is kind of enough to make people feel as though they're really kind of standing out from a group or a crowd. It takes 3 people to kind of constitute that group or crowd. The study has been replicated a number of times, not just by Asch, but by other social psychologists through the years. And there's been different variations that have produced some interesting results. As the previous slide just demonstrated, you do get more conformity with more Confederates, but only up to a point. After 3 people, you don't really get more conformity as you increase the number of Confederates. Teenagers conform more than adults. This could also speak to the normative influence and the normative pressures underlying this phenomenon. Teenagers often have greater acceptance for social approval than older adults do, so that somewhat speaks to the mechanism involved. The other finding is that you get less conformity when participants believe that the Confederates can't hear the results. So this really does demonstrate the power of criticism or potentially social disapproval in shaping a person's behavior. So in this variation, the Confederates give the wrong answer 12 times, but here participants just write their answer on a piece of paper, and they don't have to worry about saying their answer out loud. And conformity in this situation drops dramatically and occurs really only on an average of 1 to 2 trials across those 12 trials. Okay, so it really does speak to the normative influence and the social disapproval of having to say my answer out loud when we write it on a piece of paper, much less conformity. And then, okay, so that's that result. And then there's cultural differences as well. So when this has been repeated in other countries, you see a conformity effect in virtually every culture that has been studied. But researchers have found more conformity in collectivistic cultures, such as Japan and China, than in individualistic countries, such as the United States. So this also speaks to the need for social approval in collective, or we could say just the importance of group harmony in collective cultures. Those cultures emphasize the group and the collective over individualism. All right, so moving on to obedience. Obedience refers to following an order or command from somebody in a position of authority. Again, it has negative connotations often in the US, but in many situations, obedience certainly has beneficial effects. We're taught in an early age to obey our parents, and then that, as well as our teachers, police officers, they're considered to be examples of legitimate authority figures. They're there to help us, guide us, they're on our side. And so as children, we're taught to follow these people. We're also taught to follow the instructions from people that are a lifeguard or a firefighter, that there's basically people that are there to help us and to protect us. And so obeying their orders makes sense. It's a good thing. But of course, there's also a dark side to obedience. In the name of following orders or I was just doing my job, people can at times violate ethical principles and even break the law. So very disturbingly, obedience has often been the basis of some of our worst human behaviors, especially in wartime. So soldiers following orders because they're following, their commander or their leader. That's been the basis of massacres, atrocities, genocides that we've seen during wartime. So there's absolutely a dark side of obedience as well. And one of these, very salient examples of the dark side of obedience was the Holocaust and the actions of German citizens during the Second World War. There's been other examples, of course, but that's a very well-known one. And I focus on that because trying to understand why so many otherwise decent German citizens went along with the brutality of Nazi leadership during the Holocaust was the basis for one of the most famous experiments on obedience conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s. So to investigate obedience, Milgram conducted a series of laboratory experiments to see if he could get participants to behave in a way that would be kind of against their own nature by simply being instructed to conform with a set of rules delivered by an authority figure. So he did several studies, but the basic procedure, the participants were working class men of various ages and backgrounds from New Haven, Connecticut, which is the area around Yale University where Stanley Milgram was a professor. So in the experiment, participants were required to administer electric shocks remotely, as in a different room, or sometimes in the same room but at distance, to somebody who was a test subject. And they had to do so according to fairly arbitrary rules. So basically the cover story was that it was an experiment on learning, and the idea would be to see if delivering a shock or a punishment would affect the rate at which the learner could learn a series of word lists or word pairings. Okay, so the participant was required to shock the learner anytime the learner made a mistake in the word. Basically, it was a memory task. So as it turned out, the electric shocks were not real, and the learners were actually Confederates, that is, actors, that only pretended to be electrocuted. At the beginning of the experiment, the electrical shocks were extremely mild, and the people that were the true participants actually got a dose of the electric shock. Okay. But as the experiment progressed, and you'll see this machine right here, the participants were instructed to give increasingly painful voltages of shock for each incorrect answer. And as they moved incrementally up this shock machine, at the very end, based on the labels on the machine, the amount of shock that they were giving implied quite a bit of pain, even extreme danger, and potentially even death. That was all essentially reinforced by an audio recording that had pre-recorded responses from the Confederate. So the Confederate in all cases was this man, and the participants in the other room heard responses from him. These were pre-recorded. He would yell out in pain. He would say, "Ouch." He refused to continue. He yelled, "Stop! Get me out of here!" And at one point, he just stopped answering altogether. And when he stopped answering altogether, participants were still instructed to continue administering what they potentially thought were lethal dosage of shock. Okay, you see the gentleman right here in the white lab coat, not Stanley Milgram, but was another person, another actor who was playing the role of the experimenter. So you might be asking, how many people went all the way up to the very end and administered what they thought was potentially a lethal dose of shock? So here's the results. What you can see is that 65% of participants gave the very, very highest level of shock, which didn't even have a label. It was just, we don't know what happens when you give this amount of shock. Okay. All participants went up at least until 300 volts, and then you can see where some people stopped at the kind of extreme intensity and even at the danger. But 65%, so the vast majority, went to the very end. So this was the case even though the learner, the Confederate, pretended to be unconscious at certain points. So the average shock delivered was 360 volts. And 80% of participants continued giving shocks even after the learner cried out in pain, saying that his heart was bothering him. And again, it's important to know that that was just a Confederate. It wasn't an actual person that was being harmed. So what's been very interesting is that virtually everyone, when asked, say that they would stop early in the process. Okay, so if we want to ask ourselves, how many people do you think would actually go up to that 450? Generally speaking, people that aren't aware of the study, so this would include psychology students, middle class adults, and even psychiatrists, only think that 1% of people would go all the way up to the maximum shock. That only a small number of people could be that cruel or that sadistic. But what Milgram's experiment showed was that nearly 63% of participants went all the way up to that level. Oh, and if I didn't mention, sorry, I should have, this is the video, which will give you a better sense for what the procedure looks like. And so I would highly encourage people to click on that YouTube right there. All right. So Milgram did a couple different variations, different versions of his study. And so the one that I just described is known as the standard lab version. And then he wanted to see like what different factors can be put in place that might reduce obedience to an authority. So the first is that the rate drops off when the study takes place in a nondescript office location rather than the Yale Psychology Department. So the idea here is that people might have been more willing to obey an authority because it was taking place at Yale. That's viewed as more legitimate. There's maybe the thought that, hey, this doesn't seem right to me, but it's being done at a prestigious university. Well, away from Yale, that obedience rate drops. Obedience also drops when the teacher has to place the learner's hand on the shock plate. So rather than just flipping the lever and having that person be in another room, when they have to physically place the learner's hand on the shock plate, conformity decreases. And by the way, what we're looking at here is the number of people that give the maximum shock. So even in that situation, we're still looking at 30 people that are giving the maximum shock. In another variation, the experimenter is not in the same room. So they're giving commands, I believe it was over phone, where they're located, or it could have been an intercom, I'm sorry, I don't recall the detail, but they're located remotely. So again, here too, you can see obedience to an authority, and that's greatly diminished when that authority is not physically present. When two other Confederate teachers refuse to go on with the study, only 10% of people continue to go all the way till the end. And then if given the choice to select their own shock levels, most participants, a very small number, I forget again what this exact number is. It is, no, I'm sorry, I don't have it. But it's something less than 5%, I believe, end up giving the maximum shock. So through all these different variations, it kind of gives a sense of when people are more versus less willing to obey an authority. When there is a legitimate authority that is physically present, and when we're on our own, we are more willing to obey. But when that person is not physically present, when we have other people that will stand up and rebel, people are less likely to fully obey. So despite the contributions and just how powerful a demonstration this was of our tendency to obey an authority, many now consider the procedures unethical. One of the reasons is that the research involved deception. The participants were being lied to and were led to believe that the learner, the person that was the Confederate, was being harmed. and he wasn't. So even at the end of the study, there was a full debriefing in which there was a reconciliation, and the person who was the learner was brought in, and the person who was the participant and played the role of the teacher, they were brought in and said, "Hey, this person's okay." They were still lied to and deceived at the beginning. It also lacked fully informed consent, and that goes along with the deception. Is that in order to, to get people's kind of true behaviors and responses, you can't fully inform them as to what the research involved. Playing that role of the teacher and administering the shocks caused psychological distress. There's a full video that documents the procedure. It's much longer, but I would encourage you to go out on YouTube and check it out. But you can see the amount of distress that the participants are under. It wasn't made clear whether participants could withdraw from the study, so they didn't know that was an option. Participants learned unpleasant things about themselves. They learned that they were somebody that was capable of giving a very extreme shock, and that was unpleasant to learn that about themselves. So we won't see this study ever again in our lives because it's viewed as unethical. And so even though it's a very powerful demonstration, it's just controversial and not one that we will ever see repeated in this exact way. Okay. However, importantly, it did raise the question. The Milgram studies were done in the 60s. Was the obedience that he saw there a function of having these working class male participants in the time period of the 60s? And would you get that same amount of obedience if the study was replicated today? Well, because of the unethical nature of the study, you can't replicate it exactly. But what a social psychologist, Jerry Berger, did in 2009 was to get at the closest thing possible. And so he revised the procedures. And so it was much like the original. In the Berger study, he had an experimenter use the same kind of verbal instructions. You must go on. It's essential that you continue. Berger's participants were adults that were recruited through newspaper advertisements. Their age was a little bit more broad. So in the Berger study, their age ranged from 20 to 81 years old. Average age was 43. They're more ethnically diverse and slightly more highly educated. So 40% of the people in this study had college degrees, and 20% had advanced degrees, where in the original study, most people didn't have college degrees. And so here's a slight change in procedure. So what Berger did was he only had people go up to 150 volts. And what he had determined was that in the original study is that if there was ever going to be a place where people started to disobey the experimenter, it would actually be very early on at 150 volts. And most people that continued after 150 volts went to the very end. Okay, so of the 62.5% that gave the maximum voltage, if the people that were going to stop before that typically stopped at this point. And so Berger said, okay, let me just go up to 150 volts and see how many obeyed versus disobeyed at this point. What he found, and then a couple other things, Berger explicitly and repeatedly told the participants that they could leave at any time. So what he found is that in his study, he got a 70% obedience rate at 150 volts compared to the 82.5% that continued up until that point in the Milgram study. So, and statistically, this is not a statistically significant difference. So his conclusion was that Obedience is likely to be not too different, and it's not necessarily a function of when the Milgram study took place or even who the participants were. So again, I would really encourage you to watch the YouTube video that I posted. I can describe it in words, but it's a much more powerful demonstration to actually take a look and see how the study was conducted. So, all right, well, this wraps it up for the lecture on conformity and obedience. I hope you've learned a little bit more about these topics after listening to this lecture.